If you're not pouring back into yourself, the message that you're sending to your child is that not putting time and care into yourself is a perfectly acceptable thing to do. When you're in survival mode, anything that feels like effort is the first thing to go. Often when we're really struggling, when we're feeling overwhelmed and burnt out, our self-care and our attention to our own needs can really suffer. Self-care needs to be encouraged, not just when we're at a breaking point, because when we're at a breaking point, it's essential. We need to make it an essential part of our day, just like eating and breathing and showering. I also have a very active, nearly 2-year-old who refuses to sleep, so I know a little bit more than the average person about complete self-neglect of our personal care. But that's a whole story for another day. People often think that self-care is for people who are suffering, but it's actually more about the whole idea of prevention being better than cure. It's a maintenance thing that you do daily to stop yourself and prevent yourself from burning out, becoming overwhelmed, so that you don't end up feeling like you're in constant survival mode. And actually feeling like you're in a constant state of survival mode can lead to things like anxiety, depression, insomnia, and a whole host of other physical and mental health related issues. It can affect the way you look, it can affect the way you feel, it can affect your relationships, it can affect your ability to function, it can affect your ability as a parent, as a friend, as a spouse, as a daughter, as a sibling. You get the idea. When you start paying attention to your self-care, you become so much more in tune with your body, and you'll become so much better at recognizing when you're starting to get overwhelmed, when you're falling into burnout, or even if you just need to take a breath and pause for a minute. By doing this, you'll be able to prevent yourself from complete burnout, complete overwhelm, and from all of the negative impacts of what I said earlier. So I think that self-care is often looked because people are striving for a version of self-care that doesn't really reflect what they personally need. You might see somebody with an elaborate skincare routine or an elaborate pamper routine, but actually for you, self-care might just be the acknowledgement of I need to take 5 minutes a day just to drink a cup of coffee. If this is the case, you might find that there's certain things that you do that don't make you feel good when they might be really working for other people. But in this case, it's not really self-care, it's them care. All this means is that you haven't yet worked out what's best for you. So when it comes to thinking about your self-care, whatever type of self-care you do end up adopting, you need to make it work for you. You need to find relief in it. You need to feel like you're enjoying it. Otherwise, it just ends up being like another thing to do on your never-ending to-do list. And as I said earlier, if you are operating in that mode, then self-care will be the first thing to go. So you'll just end up in this vicious cycle. I can do separate videos on different types of self-care for things like anxiety, depression, or other situations in life that people might be going through, but in this one I'm going to focus on maternal mental health. Often when we think about our idea of mental health and self-care, we often equate this to someone who's looking physically disheveled and looking as though they're self-neglecting as an indication of poor mental health. But then we often assume that if someone's looking great and always looking immaculate, then that means that they're not struggling mentally, and this isn't always the case. It's such an internal battle, and yes, even though signs of self-neglect are indication of a mental health crisis, looking great doesn't mean that there isn't an internal struggle. You often see people when they're going through a big life change that they'll do something dramatic to their hair, like cut it off or change colour or change the style completely. I would say there's more to it other than the face value of vanity, otherwise these things wouldn't be connected. Before I go into some tips about self-care, and I say this based on my own personal experience of completely neglecting myself when I had my baby, and actually even during pregnancy. So none of this is coming from a place of judgment, this is coming from a place of pure wisdom that I feel that I've gained from getting it all wrong myself. If you haven't put that time into yourself, even if you're getting your child dressed every day, even if you're putting all of your time into making sure your child is clean, fed, tidy, immaculate looking, if you're not pouring back into yourself, the message that you're sending to your child is that not putting time and care into yourself is a perfectly acceptable thing to do. Children learn much more from our actions than they do from our words. Let that sit with you for a minute. When I realized this, things changed dramatically for me. I'm definitely still on a journey, and it's definitely going to be an ongoing process. But I'm in a much better place mentally and physically than I was when I first had my child and I was completely self-neglecting. If we see our child stressing, not sleeping, feeling anxious, feeling burnt out, what is all of the advice that we would give them? Yet we don't do it to ourselves. In fact, what we do is we model the complete opposite of what we're saying. And by modeling, we're teaching them not to do those things. So show them the importance of care and attention into themselves so that it becomes ingrained into their core values. so that, as I said earlier, if they are in survival mode, because there will be times in their lives when they will struggle, they don't end up neglecting self-care. They understand that it's important as a preventative measure and even more essential when they are feeling burnt out and overwhelmed. Another thing when it comes to maternal mental health, and I can actually do a separate video on postnatal depression and postnatal anxiety and postnatal OCD. Let me know if that's something you want to see and I can add that to my list of video topics. I often find that when it comes to motherhood, there's a stigma of martyrdom. And what I mean is that there's an expectation that why are you thinking about yourself when you have a kid to look after? And I think I personally fell into this mode myself, but I would also look at other people who weren't self-neglecting and I'd be like, oh my God, I wish I was like that. But let me tell you now, things weren't like they were 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago when there were whole villages of people who were contributing to the raising of your child. Now mothers are having to do pretty much everything themselves, and even if you do have support, doesn't mean that your struggles aren't internal and aren't unique to you. We all find it difficult, so never minimize someone else's experience and never minimize your own. The fact is, mothers need to be in the best frame of mind. And when I say mother, I mean anyone in a parenting or caring position. Some situations are complicated and it's not necessary that the biological mother is the one who's taking care of the child. The point of this video is that if you are in a caring position for anyone, whether or not it's maternal, paternal, grandparental, or if you're a young carer or an elderly carer, the importance of self-care is essential. Another thing you might want to think about is getting comfortable with saying no. This is an ongoing process for people who've struggled to say no, whereas my husband's the complete opposite. His default answer to almost anything is no, whereas my default answer is almost always yes. So this is definitely something that I'm working on getting better at, and so is he. But when it comes to getting comfortable with saying no, I know it's not always easy, but this is something I'm going to have to talk about in a separate video because I've picked up so many bits of advice and bits of wisdom over the years about how to get better at this. And as I said, it's an ongoing journey. But you will often hear, and I absolutely agree with this, that every single time you say yes to something, you're saying no to something else. You just have to really get in tune with what you're saying yes and no to. There's so many mental processes that go into this, but once it becomes clear, it becomes so much easier than you actually think. But I don't want this video to get too long, so I'll do that in a separate one. But another thing I want to say is to remove negative influences. Now, I'm a big fan of if anything's making you feel negative or feeling toxic, then it needs to go. Now, there is that whole argument about people need to develop conflict resolution skills, which I absolutely agree with. But my assumption is that if you've tried and things haven't worked, and you've tried again and they haven't worked, and you've tried once again and they haven't worked, and you've continued to try and they still haven't worked, then it might not be suitable for you at this point in your life, or maybe forever. Who's to say we're limited to just this current moment? But when you're at an enhanced state of anxiety or depression, or your mood is low, or if you're feeling overwhelmed or burnt out, sometimes removing the triggers that get you caught up in a mood that distracts you away from all of the things that you want to achieve and want to do, just temporarily, even if you shut it down temporarily, then that's advisable. I've done a whole separate video on how to remove some of the toxicity. The easiest way to remove some of the toxicity is on social media. We have so much control over what we're exposed to. I'll link to that video in the cards. My next tip is to let it out. Now, this could be through journaling, it could be through speaking to a friend or a loved one, it could be accessing a helpline. I always have details of helplines in the description box, so make sure to check those out if you need it. But you can also even consider therapy. So there's one thing I do every day, which is what I call my moan of the day, which is I rant for about 2 to 3 minutes about everything and anything that's annoying me, and that is one of my biggest forms of self-care for me personally. I'll link to a video on why you shouldn't hold things in and practical things that you can do to start opening up more. When it comes to this kind of thing, I describe it as a boiling pot. It's boiling and you can try and put a cover on it, you can try and put a lid on it, but eventually the mess will be worse than if you just dealt with it and just turned the heat down. My next tip is to just commit to 15 minutes a day. In those 15 minutes, you can do anything you like. For you, self-care might be a bit of meditation. It might be drinking a cup of coffee. It might be watching some TV. It might be contacting a loved one. It could be going out for a walk. It could be some yoga. It could be some exercise. It could be a pamper session in the bath. It could be a bit of skincare, listening to some music, reading a book. But just start with 15 minutes. Commit to having those 15 minutes to yourself every single day. But I want to put this question across to you, and it'll probably apply more to the people who really are struggling, because it's definitely a question I had to ask myself too. When you first sit down to give yourself that attention, it might feel a little bit alien to you. It might feel a bit odd and a bit bizarre and a bit uncomfortable for a moment. But really ask yourself why. Why is it so difficult that out of nearly 1,500 minutes in a day, we're struggling to take even 10 minutes to ourselves? Really sit with that for a moment and ask what has happened for it to get to this point. Where has our focus been that it's becoming such a struggle? If you look at the screen time reports on your phone, you'll probably realize that you're spending an hour on Instagram, 2 hours on YouTube, an hour on Twitter. And if this makes you feel good and if it's part of your self-care, then absolutely fine. But if it's not, and then you're struggling to find even say 10 to 15 minutes to yourself, think about the way that you can reorganize your time to suit your self-care a bit better. My next tip is to give yourself the same care and attention that you give others. The way that you would give your child a bath and prepare them after they've had their bath and relax them afterwards. Put that time into yourself. Put those same processes into yourself. The same way that you might be there for your friend that's called you. Don't be afraid to get that reciprocated. And tying in with this one, the same advice that you give to other people, give it to yourself. I know I'm working on this one. So this is not coming from a place of judgment, and it's not coming from a place of telling people what to do, but it's definitely coming from a place of having an internal compass about where we should at least try to navigate ourselves a little bit. My next tip is to set yourself a 30-day self-care challenge. Aim for 30 days, but even if that feels too much, commit to 7 days. Commit to 7 days of 15 minutes a day, just concentrating on the things that make you feel good. And schedule it in, whether it's first thing in the morning before your baby's woken up, or as soon as your baby's gone to sleep in the evening, or whether or not it's calling on support that you have, like friends or family, so that you can be allowed to have the time that you need to take care of your self-care. So as I said, start with 7 days. Commit to 7 days of 15 minutes a day of doing something that makes you feel good and makes you feel great, and then extend it by another week and aim for 30 days. So even though we're starting as a 30-day challenge, the idea is to hopefully adopt this as an ongoing regular habit. If you miss a day, then reset and start the next day as day one again. By doing this, you'll just be making it longer and longer, which is great. But always with anything, and one of my favorite bits of advice is to take baby steps. Now I can link to 2 books like Atomic Habits and Tiny Habits, both in the description box. But the power of tiny baby steps, micro habits, atomic habits, is that it's more sustainable, it's more achievable, and it won't be the first thing to go the moment that you're in survival mode. My next tip is to reevaluate your current routine, whatever that routine looks like for you, whether it's a personal care routine, whether or not it's your daily routine, whether or not it's the day that you have planned with your child. If you're in survival mode, then this is the time to reevaluate your current routine and see about all the ways that you can simplify it as much as possible. Can you make more simple dishes? Can you drop a couple of projects that you might have on? If it's something like your makeup, can you simplify your makeup routine? It needs to feel easy or it won't be sustainable. My next tip is to encourage others to attend to their self-care as well, and then practice what you preach. Normalize it in your conversation so that you can create a culture that accepts self-care as a basic norm and values it for what it really is, an essential part of your functioning as a human in society. So let me know which one of these tips resonated with you the most, and let me know if you've really struggled with your self-care when you've gone into a new situation, when you become a parent or a carer. How has this affected you, and have you started taking steps away from it? At what point of your journey are you in? Share it with the community and maybe you can help other people around you. For more content on mental health, productivity and lifestyle, make sure to hit the subscribe button. I upload twice a week, and I will see you in my next one.